The storm had been building since noon, dragging itself across the New Mexico flatlands like something wounded and unwilling to stop. By 7 in the evening, the sky had gone the color of old iron, and the wind came in sideways off the desert floor, carrying sand and ice in equal measure. Interstate 40 had emptied out to almost nothing. The few remaining headlights moved slow and uncertain, as if the drivers themselves had stopped believing there was anything on the other end worth reaching. The Broken Spur Diner sat alone at mile marker 187, the kind of place that existed only because someone had run out of gas 40 years ago and decided to stay. Its neon sign buzzed and crackled in the wind, half the letters dead. The parking lot held three vehicles: a rust-eaten pickup, a delivery van with Arizona plates, and a Harley-Davidson Softail parked close to the door, leaning into the storm like a scarred animal that had forgotten how to lie down. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and bacon grease and the wet wool of coats that would never fully dry. 6 people occupied the space. A truck driver hunched over soup at the counter, a young couple sharing a plate of fries and saying nothing to each other, the kind of silence that meant either exhaustion or the end of something. A waitress in her 50s with varicose veins visible through her stockings, refilling cups without being asked. The cook, invisible behind the pass-through window, clanking pans with the slow rhythm of a man who had stopped caring about time. And Ryder Callahan. He sat in the last booth, the one pressed against the far wall where the heating vent didn't reach. His back faced the corner. His eyes faced the door. This was not habit. This was architecture, something 3 tours in places whose names he no longer said out loud had built into his nervous system, wired so deep that dismantling it would require dismantling everything else along with it. He was 41 years old. His hands were scarred across the knuckles, the kind of damage that comes from hitting things harder than bone. His jaw carried a beard that hadn't been trimmed in weeks, dark with streaks of gray that had arrived early and without permission. His leather jacket was cracked at the shoulders, patched at the elbows, and smelled of rain and highway exhaust, and something older underneath all of it. Something that never washed out, no matter how many miles you put between yourself and the place it came from. He drank black coffee. No sugar, no cream. The cup was his third. He wasn't hungry, but he'd ordered toast because the waitress kept glancing at him with the particular nervousness people reserve for men who look like they might either cry or break something. The toast sat untouched, going cold on a plate he hadn't touched either. 11 days since he'd spoken to another person. Not by accident, by design. 11 days since Tucson, since the hospital, since the call that came at 3 in the morning and rearranged the architecture of his chest so completely that he'd sat on the edge of a motel bed for 6 hours without moving, phone still pressed to his ear, dial tones screaming into the silence because he hadn't thought to hang up. His mother, 67 years old, lung cancer, gone before he could cross 2 state lines. He hadn't made the funeral, hadn't called his sister, hadn't done anything except climb onto the Harley and ride north with no destination, no plan, and no reason to stop. The road was the only thing that still made sense. Not because it led anywhere, because it demanded nothing. It asked no questions. It assigned no blame. It simply unrolled beneath him mile after mile, indifferent and honest, in a way that people had never managed to be. The waitress refilled his cup without asking. He didn't look up. She didn't linger. Outside, the storm worsened. Sleet mixed with rain now tapping the windows like fingers testing for weakness. The neon sign outside gave a final flicker and died completely, plunging the parking lot into a darkness, broken only by the occasional sweep of headlights from trucks that weren't stopping. Then the door opened. The wind hit first, a blast of frozen air that made the truck driver hunch deeper into his soup, and the young couple pulled their coats tighter. Then the cold itself came through, and the rain driven sideways through the gap, and then stepping through all of it like something materializing from the storm rather than arriving from outside it. A boy. He was small, 8 years old, maybe 9 thin, in the way that meant missed meals rather than genetics. His clothes were wrong for this weather by a significant margin, a cotton jacket too light for November, In the high desert, jeans soaked through from the knees down, sneakers that had gone dark with mud and water, the laces heavy and dragging. His hair was plastered flat against his skull brown and dripping in thin streams down his face and neck. He stood in the doorway for a moment with the storm howling at his back, and the room went quiet in that involuntary way. Rooms go quiet when something doesn't fit, when something walks through the door that the door wasn't built to receive. The boy's eyes moved across the diner fast. Not the way a lost child looks around, not searching for a kind face or a warm adult or someone who resembled safety in the ordinary sense. This was different. This was assessment. This was a child reading a room the way soldiers read terrain, cataloging exits and threats and resources, and the specific weight of every person in the space, measuring each one against some internal calculation that had nothing to do with who looked friendly. His gaze passed over the truck driver, passed over the young couple, passed over the waitress who had already started moving toward him with that automatic maternal concern that some women carry like a second heartbeat. His eyes landed on Ryder, the biggest man in the room, the most dangerous looking, the one sitting alone in the darkest corner with scars on his hands and something broken behind his eyes and an untouched plate of cold toast in front of him like a small monument to not caring. The boy walked straight toward him, not running, not crying, moving with the deliberate trembling control of someone who has already made a decision and is now simply executing it no matter how much the execution costs. His small fists were clenched at his sides. Water ran from his hair in thin streams, and for a moment crossing that floor, it was impossible to tell what was rain on his face and what wasn't. The waitress stopped. The truck driver looked up from his soup. Even the cook appeared in the pass-through window spatula, frozen at an angle in the air. The boy reached Ryder's booth. He stood there dripping onto the linoleum, both hands still fisted at his sides, and he looked at Ryder with the specific kind of steadiness that only comes from having already accepted the worst and choosing to act anyway. Ryder looked back at him. His coffee cup sat halfway to his mouth, frozen there by the sheer improbability of the moment. The boy's voice came out barely above a whisper, cracked at the edges, but each word was placed carefully, deliberately, like stones being laid one at a time across a gap that might not hold. Please pretend you're my dad. The words landed in the diner like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples went out in every direction at once. Ryder set his coffee down. The ceramic clicking against the table was the loudest sound in the room. He studied the boy in front of him. The mud-caked sneakers, the too-thin jacket, the eyes that were brown and steady and carrying something no 8-year-old should know how to carry. He had seen that expression before. Not from fatherhood, which he had never known. Not from childhood, which he had buried so completely that only certain smells and certain silences could still find it. He had seen it in rooms in Fallujah and corridors in Kandahar, on the faces of civilians who had already understood that the worst was coming and were making one final desperate play before it arrived. Not fear, beyond fear. The face of someone who has done the math and doesn't like the answer, but is placing the bet anyway. Ryder glanced past the boy toward the diner windows. Through the rain-streaked glass, he could see the parking lot. A vehicle had appeared while he wasn't watching, a black sedan, its headlights still on, engine running. It had pulled in close to the entrance, angled in a way that blocked the most direct path to the road. He looked back at the boy. "Sit down," Ryder said. His voice came out rough, unused, the way an engine sounds turning over after sitting idle in the cold. He moved his coffee cup to make room and nodded once toward the opposite side of the bench. No smile, no softening, just the nod and the space created by it. The boy slid into this booth so fast it was clear he'd been holding himself upright by will alone. His hands went flat on the table, immediately pressing down hard as if the surface were the only thing keeping him from being pulled somewhere he couldn't come back from. He kept his eyes fixed on Ryder's face. Brown eyes. Steady in a way that cost something. "What's your name?" Ryder said. "Eli." A pause. "Eli Mercer." "Who's in the car, Eli?" The boy's jaw tightened. His fingers curled slightly against the table but didn't lift. "I don't know his real name. He told my mom his name was Mr. Warren, but she said that wasn't who he really was. Where's your mom? The question hit something. Eli's composure cracked along a fault line so fine it was almost invisible. His lower lip moved. His eyes went liquid at the edges. But he didn't cry. He swallowed it down with a kind of practiced violence that made the muscles in Ryder's jaw tighten. Because children shouldn't know how to do that. Children shouldn't have to know. She's gone, Eli said. She told me to run 3 days ago. She said if I stopped running, they would find me. She said find someone big, someone who looks scary. She said that scary people are sometimes the safest. 3 days. Ryder let that settle in his chest. He didn't reach for it or examine it too closely. Just let it sit there. Eli's right sleeve had ridden up slightly at the cuff, and Ryder caught a glimpse of a long scrape along the inside of the boy's forearm, raw at the center, darkening at the edges. The kind of mark that comes from falling hard in the dark from concrete or rock, or the unforgiving edge of something that doesn't move when a small body hits it. He had read enough bodies in enough bad places to know that Mark was 3 days old. Give or take. The boy hadn't been lying. The diner door opened again. The man who entered was nothing like what the moment seemed to call for. No muscle, no visible threat, no urgency in his movements. He was perhaps 50 years old, slender, wearing a dark wool overcoat that still held its shape despite the rain outside. His shoes were leather, dark brown and clean, conspicuously clean, which meant he had been careful about where he stepped in a parking lot that was currently a sheet of standing water and mud. His hair was silver at the temples, neatly parted. His face was composed, pleasant. The kind of face that appeared on brochures for financial advisors and family attorneys, the kind of face designed at a fundamental level to make people feel that everything was being handled by capable and trustworthy hands. He stepped inside, brushed rain from his shoulders with 2 precise motions, scanned the room with the same quick efficiency Eli had used but slower, more practiced, and when his eyes reached the back booth, they stopped. Something shifted behind them. Not alarm. Recognition. The kind of adjustment a hunter makes when the terrain turns out to be different from the map. The man smiled. It was an excellent smile, warm in all the right places, professional in the way that only comes from years of deploying it in precisely the situations where it was most needed. Under the table, Eli's hand found Ryder's forearm and gripped it with a strength that should not have been possible from fingers that small. "Excuse me." The man's voice carried across the diner with the calm assurance of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. He walked toward the booth with the unhurried confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed before he finished speaking. "I'm looking for my nephew. He ran off from the car during the storm. I've been worried sick." Ryder looked at Eli. Eli's face had gone white, not the white of embarrassment or the white of a child caught doing something wrong. The white of a body redirecting blood away from the skin and toward the organs, preparing for impact. Preparing for the thing that has been coming for 3 days to finally arrive. "He's not my uncle," Eli whispered. The words came out pressed flat, barely disturbing the air between them. The way people speak when they know the wrong ears are close. Ryder looked back at the man. He took him apart the way the Marines had trained him to take apart a room. The overcoat was expensive, $3,000 at least. The watch was expensive. Everything about him projected authority and earned trust. Everything about him had been selected and arranged to make people comply before they had finished deciding whether to. But there were other things. The way his weight stayed on the balls of his feet. The way his right hand hung slightly forward, fingers loose, not relaxed, not the looseness of ease, but the looseness of readiness of a hand that has been trained to be available. The way his smile didn't shift when his eyes moved, as if the face and the mind operating behind it were running entirely separate programs. Ryder had seen men like this before, in briefing rooms, in intelligence reports, in footage from interrogation sessions where the people asking the questions wore suits and the people answering them stopped answering after a while. "He's with me," Ryder said. 6 syllables. No aggression in them, no performance of toughness. Just a wall built from language and placed directly in the man's path. The man's smile held without effort. I understand the confusion. He's been through a great deal these past few days. His mother had an episode, a mental health situation. We've been trying to get him back to his family. I'm his Uncle Dale Weston. I can show you identification if that would help. He's with me, Ryder said again. The exact same words, the exact same tone, not louder, not harder, just there. Something in the delivery made the truck driver set his spoon down, made the young couple stop pretending they weren't watching, made the waitress take one slow step backward toward the kitchen. Weston let the smile drop by a single barely perceptible degree. Sir, I appreciate your concern. Truly. But this is a family matter. The boy is confused and frightened. I'm here to take him home where he belongs. Then call the police, Ryder said. Let them sort it out. A pause. Microscopic. A fracture in the performance so small that only someone who had spent years watching for exactly that kind of fracture would have caught it. Cell service is down because of the storm, Weston said smoothly. As I'm sure you've noticed. That's why I've been driving these roads for the past 2 hours looking for him. If we could simply wait for things to clear, I'm sure we can leave or wait in your car, Ryder said. Those are your options. Weston looked at him, really looked for the first time, taking in the width of his shoulders and the scars on his hands and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to men who have been in enough violent situations to understand that the most dangerous moment is always the one before anything actually happens. The calculation was visible in the slight shift of Weston's jaw, the fraction of a second it took to run the math and arrive at a different conclusion than the one he'd walked in with. I'll wait in my car, Weston said. The smile returned, but it had changed temperature. What had been professional warmth was now something thinner, something with edges underneath it. He turned and walked back through the diner. His shoes clicked against the floor with the measured precision of a metronome, each step exactly the same as the last. The door opened. The storm roared through the gap. The door closed. Through the rain-streaked window, Ryder watched the sedan's interior light come on briefly and then go dark. The engine did not stop. The car did not move. It simply sat there in the darkness of the parking lot like a held breath, like something patient that had learned the particular value of patience. He's not going to stop, Eli said. The boy's hand was still on Ryder's forearm. He hadn't released it when Weston left. He never stops, Eli said. There were others before him, but he's the one they send when the others can't find you. Ryder looked down at the boy. His mind was already running calculations. Exits, the fire door through the kitchen, the layout of the parking lot, the angle of the sedan, the distance between the diner's east wall and where his Harley was parked. What did your mother find Eli? What was she protecting? Eli's eyes moved to his backpack where it sat on the bench beside him. A beaten green JanSport with one broken zipper and duct tape holding the bottom seam together. The kind of bag that looked like it contained nothing worth taking. Evidence, Eli said. She worked for a judge, Judge Harlan Voss in Albuquerque. She found things, files, recordings, bad things, people being moved, kids being... He stopped. His throat worked. She copied everything onto drives. She put them in my bag. She was going to give them to someone. A reporter in Denver. Her name is Sandra Marsh. His voice broke on the last syllable. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a single clean snap of something that had been held under tension for too long. And for a moment, sitting there in the last booth of a dying diner with rain hammering the windows and a black sedan idling 30 feet away, he was just a boy. Just an exhausted, terrified, grieving child sitting across from a stranger because a woman who had known she might not make it home had told him to find someone big and scary. Ryder reached across the table and put his hand on the back of Eli's neck, not pulling him close, not embracing him, just the weight of it, the pressure, the way his squad leader used to do it in foxholes when the shelling got close and the waiting became its own kind of violence. A hand on the neck that said without words that there was another person in the room, that the next breath didn't have to be taken alone. "Breathe," Ryder said. Eli breathed. "You've been running for 3 days," Ryder said. A nod. Alone. Another nod. Ryder looked out through the glass at the parking lot. The sedan sat in the dark patient as stone rain drumming its roof in steady sheets. Its presence there had stopped feeling like a parked vehicle. It felt like a countdown. He checked his phone under the table. No signal, not even a flicker. The storm had taken everything. Cell towers, probably satellite coverage. And from the look of the dead telephone mounted to the wall near the register, the landlines had gone out hours ago. No police, no phone, no help coming from any direction that didn't require getting through what was sitting in the parking lot first. Ryder drank the last of his coffee. It was cold. He set the cup down and looked at the boy across from him, and he thought about every reason he had to stand up and walk to the counter and tell the waitress to call someone when the phones came back, and then walk out to his Harley and ride north and let the world keep turning without him. He had been doing exactly that for 11 days, letting the world turn without him. It had been the only thing that didn't hurt in a new way. His ex-wife had used a specific word in the voicemail she left the day she filed. One word that arrived at the end of a long sentence about all the ways he had failed to show up. The word was late. "You're always late, Ryder. You're always too late." He had listened to that voicemail 6 times in the parking lot of a gas station in Flagstaff, and then deleted it, and it hadn't mattered, because the word was already in him, already part of the wiring, already confirmed by everything that had come after. Too late to his mother's bedside. Too late to his own marriage. Too late to whatever version of himself might have been worth saving back when saving it was still an option. He looked at Eli. Eli looked back at him with the eyes of a child who expected nothing. Not hope, not rescue, just the flat, exhausted assessment of someone who had already learned that when the real moment comes, the one that actually costs something, most adults find a reason to look somewhere else. Something shifted in Ryder's chest. Not warmth, not sentimentality, something older than both of those. Something that felt more like the click of a mechanism engaging. The specific sensation of a decision being made in a place below thought, below language, in whatever part of a person remains after everything else has been stripped away by years of accumulated loss. "You're going to do exactly what I say," Ryder said. "When I say it. No questions. Can you do that?" Eli nodded once. "Put your backpack on. Both straps." Eli obeyed. The green JanSport went across his shoulders, both straps cinched tight, the duct tape bottom pressed flat against his back. Ryder stood. He dropped a 20 on the table twice what the coffee and untouched toast had cost, and looked at the waitress where she stood behind the counter with her coffee pot frozen in mid-pour, and her eyes asking a question she hadn't decided whether to say out loud. "Back door," Ryder said. She hesitated one beat, then she pointed toward the kitchen. "Through the kitchen, past the walk-in. There's a fire exit goes out to the dumpsters on the east side." Ryder took Eli's hand. The boy's fingers were cold, small. They gripped back with that same impossible strength, and they moved together through the kitchen, where the cook stepped aside without a word, a man who had stopped asking questions about the things that happened in his diner long before this particular storm arrived. The fire exit was a steel door with a push bar, and when Ryder hit it, the storm came through like a living thing. Wind and rain and sleet tearing at their faces and their hands, and everything exposed. The cold was immediate and physical, the kind that doesn't ease into you, but arrives all at once, replacing the air in your lungs with something that cuts. The parking lot wrapped around the building. The sedan was on the west side facing the entrance. Ryder's Harley was parked on the north side 30 feet from where they stood. 30 feet of open, unlit ground in a storm that reduced visibility to 20 yards in any direction. He pulled his leather jacket off and wrapped it around Eli without breaking stride. It covered the boy from his shoulders to his knees. Eli disappeared inside it, and for just a fraction of a second his face pressed into the collar and his eyes closed, and something in his expression shifted. Not safety, not yet. but the particular quality of a person encountering something that smells like the possibility of it. "Hold on to me," Ryder said. "Don't let go." They ran. Rain hit them like gravel thrown from a height. The wind pushed sideways, staggering Ryder, nearly lifting Eli clean off his feet. They reached the Harley, and Ryder had the key in the ignition before his boots had fully stopped sliding on the wet asphalt. He swung onto the bike, pulled Eli up behind him, and felt the boy's arms lock around his waist with a grip that communicated everything his words had been too careful to say. The engine caught on the first kick, a deep guttural roar that split the storm, announcing itself to everything within half a mile. The sound of something that had been built to go and was going. In the parking lot, the sedan's headlights snapped on. Ryder didn't wait. He dropped the clutch, and the Harley surged forward, rear tire fighting for grip on the wet asphalt front wheel, lifting slightly before physics pulled it back down. They hit the access road at 40. By the time they reached the on-ramp to 40, they were doing 65, and behind them the sedan was already moving. Interstate 40 stretched into darkness. Rain turned the road into a moving mirror, the bike's headlamp bouncing off standing water and catching nothing useful beyond it. The storm had emptied the highway of everything except the two of them and the headlights closing in from behind. Ryder felt Eli pressed against his back. The boy's face was turned sideways against his spine, the jacket wrapped around him like a shell. He weighed almost nothing, 100 miles of nothing, and a child who weighed almost nothing, and a man in a sedan who weighed enough to collapse the world. The headlights grew in his mirror, high beams now closing the distance. The car had horsepower and four wheels and a roof, and the kind of traction that a motorcycle in a rainstorm on a flooding highway fundamentally could not match on a straightaway. Ryder saw the exit sign ahead. Route 117 North, a mountain road, 2 lanes steep, twisting the kind of road that exists between guardrails and drop-offs, and turns that don't announce themselves until you're already committed to whatever comes next. The kind of road that turns sedans into liabilities and motorcycles into needles threading through darkness. He took the exit at 70. The lean was deep enough that his left knee nearly grazed the pavement, and he felt Eli's arms tighten without the boy making a sound. Not a gasp, not a cry, just the tightening, the adjustment, the trust communicated through grip alone. Route 117 climbed. The road narrowed. The guardrails disappeared, replaced by the absence of guardrails and the suggestion of drop-offs that fell away into valleys the headlamp couldn't reach. Pine trees crowded the shoulders, their branches whipping in the wind, throwing shadows across the beam in patterns that looked like movement and weren't. The rain turned to sleet. The temperature dropped. Ryder's hands went numb on the grips. He held on. Muscle memory and stubbornness, and something else, something new. Something that lived in the weight of the boy pressed against his back and wouldn't let go of its grip on him from the inside. They climbed for 20 minutes. In his mirror, the sedan's headlights appeared on the mountain road. Slower now, cautious on the curves, but still coming. The car closing the gap with the patient inevitability of something that has never learned how to stop. A side road appeared in the beam of the headlamp. Unpaved. No sign. Barely a suggestion of an opening in the tree line. Ryder cut the headlamp and took the turn in complete darkness, navigating by the difference in texture between asphalt and dirt and the pressure of the tires on the ground beneath them. He rolled the Harley 50 yards down the dirt track and killed the engine. Silence descended like something that had been waiting for permission. The storm still raged in the trees overhead. Wind tore through the pines, sleet ticked against the bike's chrome, rain hammered the forest floor. But the specific silence of a stopped engine in the dark, the absence of pursuit, the sudden vertigo of being hidden and not knowing if hidden was enough. That silence was something else entirely. 30 seconds passed. A minute. 2. Then the sedan appeared on Route 117. Its headlights swept through the trees as it passed the side road without slowing. The engine sound built, peaked and faded as the car continued climbing the mountains, searching for something that was no longer on the road it was searching. Ryder let out a breath he had not known he was holding. "Is he gone?" Eli whispered. "For now." Ryder climbed off the bike and lifted Eli down. The boy's legs buckled when they hit the ground. Ryder caught him under the arms and held him upright until his muscles remembered what they were for. "There's a ranger station," Ryder said, "half a mile up this road. Closed for the winter. We'll shelter there." He pushed the Harley to keep it quiet. Eli walked beside him, swallowed inside the leather jacket, his backpack a small shape between his shoulder blades. Neither of them spoke. The forest closed around them, old and cold and indifferent to everything happening inside it. The ranger station emerged from the trees like a memory of something built to last. A small cabin, dark shuttered, the windows blind. The door was padlocked, but the lock was old iron, and a rock from the ground settled the argument in one swing. Inside, cold air and the smell of dust and pine resin, and the ghost of summers that had come and gone without witness. A wooden desk, 2 chairs, a cast iron wood stove in the corner, with a stack of split logs beside it left by someone who had understood that the next person through this door might need exactly this. Ryder built the fire without turning the lights on. There were no lights to turn on. He worked by field kindling first, then small pieces, then larger, waiting for the draw to establish itself, adjusting the damper by sound. Within 10 minutes, the stove was breathing steadily, and warmth began its slow reclamation of the room. Eli sat on the floor near the stove. His backpack was in his lap. His eyes were half closed, but he wasn't sleeping. He was watching Ryder with the careful, patient attention of something wild that hasn't yet decided whether the hand reaching toward it means food or capture. "You need to eat," Ryder said. He found what he had in his saddlebags: beef jerky, a bruised apple, a bottle of water. He set them on the floor in front of Eli. Eli ate the way hungry children eat, which is to say quickly and without tasting, putting food into a body that had been running on nothing for 3 days and had finally been given something to run on. When he finished, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and looked up. "Why did you help me?" he asked. Ryder looked at the fire, thought about the question honestly. He could have given a dozen answers. Most of them would have been easier than the truth. "I don't know," he said. Eli nodded, as if this were the most truthful thing any adult had said to him in a very long time. "My mom said the drives have everything," Eli said quietly. "She said there are recordings of the judge, of meetings where they talked about moving people, about money, about what to do with the ones who talked." He paused. "She said if the right person gets these drives, it's over. He goes to prison. All of them do." "Who was the right person?" "A reporter in Denver. Her name is Sandra Marsh." Ryder sat back against the wall and looked at the fire and let the full shape of it settle over him. A judge, a trafficking network, evidence on 3 USB drives carried by an 8-year-old boy across 3 days in 200 miles of desert and mountain. Professional cleaners sent to recover it. A mother who had stepped into the headlights so her son could run. This wasn't a custody dispute. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was the kind of thing that got people buried in places where the ground never gave them back. He reached for his phone again. Still nothing. Not a flicker of signal. The storm had killed everything between this mountain and the rest of the world. He looked at the boy. Eli's eyes were closing now. The exhaustion had finally overwhelmed whatever had been holding it at bay. His grip on the backpack loosened. He leaned sideways and his head came to rest against Ryder's arm, and within minutes his breathing had gone slow and deep, and the impossible tension of his small body had finally completely released. Ryder didn't move. He sat against the wall and listened to the storm and the fire, and the breathing of a child he had known for less than 2 hours, and he felt something move through him that he hadn't felt in years. Not warmth, not hope. Something older and more dangerous than both. The specific sensation of purpose arriving in a body that had forgotten what purpose felt like. The click of something engaging that had been disengaged for a very long time. He reached for his phone one more time. The screen lit the sleeping face beside him. No signal. The number he needed was still in his contacts. He had never deleted it. He wasn't sure what that said about him. Whether it was hope or habit or something in between that didn't have a clean name. Marcus Forge Dunn, president of the Iron Veil Motorcycle Club out of Flagstaff, Arizona. The man who had pulled Ryder out of a burning Humvee in Helmand Province 14 years ago. The man who had stood beside him at his lowest and never once looked away. The man Ryder had called a coward to his face in front of every brother they had, and then walked away from and then driven into the desert and not looked back. 3 years since that night. 3 years of silence that Ryder had earned and accepted and carried the way you carry something that belongs to you even when you'd rather set it down. He looked out through the cabin's single broken window. Somewhere on the mountain road below, a man in a black sedan was turning around. He had lost them on Route 117, but he had not stopped. Men like that didn't stop. They recalculated. They checked the side roads. They found the tire tracks pressed into soft mud at the entrance to an unpaved forest road, and they followed them forward. The cleaners were coming. And Ryder Callahan, who had spent 3 years running from every bond and brotherhood and human connection that had ever asked anything of him, sat in the dark of a closed ranger station in the mountains above New Mexico with a sleeping child pressed against his side, and understood with a clarity that felt like a blade finding the space between his ribs that there was no one coming to save them. Not yet. He needed to find a signal. He needed to get to higher ground. He needed to say 5 words he hadn't said in 3 years. Forge, I need the club. But first he needed to sit here for 1 more minute and listen to a boy sleep through a storm in a warm room with his backpack still clutched against his chest. Because some things deserve a minute before the next hard thing begins. The storm broke at 4 in the morning. Not gently, not with any of the grace that storms sometimes find at the end of themselves. It simply stopped the way a fist unclenches all at once, leaving behind a silence so complete that Ryder could hear the individual drops falling from the pine branches outside the window, and the slow tick of the wood stove cooling, and the steady, unconscious breathing of a boy who had not slept in 3 days, and was now doing so with the totality of someone who had finally spent everything he had. Ryder had not slept, had not tried. He had spent the hours with his back against the wall, and his eyes on the window, watching the tree line for movement, for the sweep of headlights through the gaps in the pines, for the shape of a man moving through darkness with a purpose that didn't include stopping. Nothing came. But nothing coming didn't mean nothing was out there. In his experience, the absence of visible threat was never the same thing as safety. It just meant the threat was being patient. And patient threats were always the ones that cost you the most. The fire had burned down to coals. The cabin was cold again, that deep mountain cold that settles into the joints and stays. His knees ached. His shoulders had locked from hours of holding the same position. When he flexed his hands, the scars across his knuckles pulled tight, like old rope stretched past what it was built to hold. He looked at Eli. The boy was curled on his side against the base of the wall. Ryder's leather jacket pulled over him like a blanket, one hand still gripping the strap of his backpack. Even in sleep, he held on. Even in sleep, the body remembered that it had somewhere to be and something to protect. Ryder eased himself upright without sound. His boots made nothing on the wooden floor. He crossed to the window and looked out into what was left of the night, the sky at its edges beginning to separate from black into the particular dark gray that comes just before dawn commits to anything. The forest stood motionless, soaked and dripping, and through the trees he could see the dirt track they had come in on. No tire tracks beyond his own, no footprints. But the mud was soft and new tracks wouldn't hold their edges long in this terrain. They needed to move. He needed a phone signal. He needed to make one call. The thought had been sitting in his chest since midnight, heavy and specific, like a stone he had been carrying in his pocket for 3 years, and had finally run out of reasons to keep there. Marcus Forge Dunn. The number still saved, never deleted. He had told himself that was habit. He had spent 3 years telling himself things that weren't quite true, because the truth required him to feel things he had decided he was finished feeling. Eli, he said, quietly, just the name. The boy's eyes opened instantly. No transition, no blinking through confusion, just immediate total wakefulness, the eyes open and present, and already scanning before the body had finished remembering where it was. It was the same quality of alertness Ryder had seen in soldiers who had been in the field long enough that sleep became something you fell into and climbed out of, rather than something that happened to you. Children shouldn't wake up like that. "We have to move," Ryder said. "There's higher ground half a mile east. I need to get a signal." Eli sat up, folded the leather jacket once precise and set it aside, put on his backpack, both straps. He was ready in under a minute, waiting by the door with his hands at his sides while Ryder checked the window one more time. Outside, the pre-dawn air hit them clean and cold, carrying the smell of wet pine and cold earth. In the particular sharpness that follows a mountain storm, everything stripped back to its essential components. The Harley sat where Ryder had left it, dew beating on the chrome in the dim light. He walked it rather than rode it, keeping the engine silent. Eli walked beside him, matching his pace without being told, and neither of them spoke because there was nothing to say yet that wouldn't be better said after the call was made. They climbed. The dirt track gave way to a deer trail, then to forest floor without any trail at all. Just pine needles and root systems and the occasional granite outcropping breaking through the soil. The elevation change was steep enough that Eli's breathing became audible behind him, labored the sound of a body running on too little for too long, being asked to do one more thing. But the boy didn't ask to stop, didn't say anything, just kept walking. At the top of the ridge, the trees thinned enough to open the sky, gray brightening towards something that might eventually become gold. Ryder checked his phone. 2 bars. Holding. He stood with the phone in his hand and looked at the contact for a long moment. The name. The number. 3 years of silence compressed into the space between his thumb and the screen. He thought about the night he had left. The garage bay in Flagstaff with its overhead lights and its smell of motor oil and spilled beer, and the weight of 8 or 9 men watching something break that they had all believed was unbreakable. Forge standing at the workbench with his hands flat on the surface and his jaw set and his eyes holding that specific stillness that meant the volcano had decided this one time not to erupt. Ryder had called him a coward, to his face, in front of everyone. He had been right about Curtis Webb, wrong about everything else. He pressed call. It rang 4 times. 5. 6. His jaw tightened with each one, his body bracing for voicemail, for the particular rejection of a phone that sees the number and makes a choice. The 7th ring cut short. "Who's this?" Not a question. A demand. Forge's voice, low and rough, the kind of voice that sounded like it had been scraped across gravel and reassembled without particular concern for how it came out. Background noise behind it, the clink of tools, a radio playing low, the ambient hum of a space that never fully went to sleep. It's Ryder. A pause long enough to be deliberate, long enough to communicate something without saying it. 3 years, Forge said. No word. And you call at 5 in the morning. I know what time it is. Do you? Another pause. Shorter this time. What do you want, Callahan? The last name was deliberate too. Not Grimm, not brother. Callahan. The formality of a surname from a man who had called him by a road name for 12 years. The distance of it measured in something more precise than words. "I've got a situation," Ryder said. "You've always got a situation. That's your whole thing. You find the situation, you ride into the situation, and then you call somebody else to pull you out of the situation." The words landed. Ryder absorbed them the way he absorbed his shoulders, set center of gravity, low expression, unchanged. There was no defense to make because the accusation was built from true things. "There's a kid, Forge," he said. Silence. An 8-year-old boy. His mother was a whistleblower. She got evidence against a federal judge running a trafficking operation out of Albuquerque. She gave the evidence to her son and told him to run. She's gone. Disappeared. The boy found me in a diner during the storm last night. There's a cleaner on our tail. Professional. The kind that doesn't stop. He could hear Forge breathing. Measured. The controlled rhythm of a man running calculations behind his eyes while keeping everything else very still. "Where are you?" "Mountains off Route 117, north of I-40, about 30 miles west of Grants." That's close to Gallup chapter territory. I know, I'm not calling Gallup, I'm calling you. The line went quiet for long enough that Ryder could hear the radio in the background shift from one song to another. Something with a steel guitar. Something old. You said trafficking, Forge said finally. Kids, Forge. The evidence is about kids. Another silence. Then the sound of Forge moving the creak of a chair, footsteps on concrete, a door opening. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Not warmer, harder. The specific hardness of a man whose line has just been crossed in a way that overrides every other consideration. Tell me everything, Forge said. Don't leave anything out. Don't edit. Don't summarize. Everything. Ryder told him. The diner, the boy, the man who called himself Weston, the backpack that drives Judge Harlan Voss, the reporter in Denver whose name was Sandra Marsh. All of it delivered in flat, precise sentences while the dawn turned the ridge from gray to pale gold, and Eli sat on a rock 10 feet away, watching Ryder's face for signals, the way he watched everything, reading the adult in front of him for information the adult wasn't saying out loud. When Ryder finished, Forge was quiet for 30 seconds. How dirty is this, Judge? He said. Dirty enough to send professionals after a child. You trust the boy. I trust what I saw in his eyes. That's not evidence, Ryder. No, but it's enough. Forge exhaled, a long, controlled release that Ryder recognized from 100 moments of decision, from 100 pre-dawn briefings in places that didn't appear on civilian maps. The sound Forge made when he had finished calculating and was committing to something that couldn't be uncommitted to. I can have 8 brothers at your location by noon, Forge said. Maybe 10, but there's a problem. Tell me. You left. You walked out. You said things that half the club hasn't forgotten and the other half can't stop thinking about. Some of these men rode with you, bled with you, and you turned your back on all of them. Not on me. On them. Ryder said nothing. There was nothing to say that would make it less true. If I bring them out there, they're not coming for you. They're coming for the kid. You understand that distinction. I understand it. And when this is over, whatever over, looks like you and I are going to have a conversation. A real one. The one we should have had 3 years ago instead of the speech you gave. Fair. Forge's voice dropped half a register. Are you sober? The question landed the way it always landed from the people who had seen him at his worst, not as an accusation, but as a wound checking itself. 14 months, Ryder said. A pause. Good, Forge said. The word carried weight without warmth. The nod of a man who had watched too many brothers lose that particular war to feel anything as simple as relieved. Stay on that ridge. Keep the kid close. Don't engage the cleaner if he finds you before we get there. I'll call when we're rolling. The line went dead. Ryder lowered the phone. His hand was not entirely steady. Not from cold. From the specific cost of that conversation, the exposure of standing in the open without cover and letting someone who had earned the right to judge him do exactly that. Eli's voice came from the rock 10 feet away. Is someone coming? Yes. People you trust. Ryder looked at the boy. People I left. There's a difference. They descended back to the cabin. Ryder rebuilt the fire. He found a hand pump outside old iron that still worked and boiled water and made Eli drink all of it and eat the last of what was in the saddlebags. The boy ate without tasting, methodical fueling the machine because the machine still had things to do. When he finished, he looked up. My mom's dead. Not a question. A statement delivered with the flat certainty of a child who has been carrying a truth too heavy for his body and has finally decided that the weight of holding it alone is worse than the weight of saying it. Ryder sat across from him. He did not reach for false comfort. He did not say they didn't know that, or maybe she was okay, or anything else that would have been easier to say and worse to hear. I don't know, he said, but I know she fought for you. Whatever happened, she fought. She always fought, Eli said. His voice was thin as paper. She fought for 2 years. She went to the police and the lawyers and the people who were supposed to help, and they all said the same thing. that she was wrong, that she was making things up, that it was too dangerous. He stopped. His hands had tightened on the backpack straps. And then she found the recordings, Eli said. And she knew she wasn't wrong. And that's when it stopped being about papers and started being about running. When did you last see her? Tuesday, 3 days ago. We were in a motel near Socorro. She woke me up at 2 in the morning. She was already dressed. She had her coat on. She looked different, like she had already decided something, and the deciding had used up everything she had left. A log shifted in the stove. The fire crackled. She gave me the backpack, Eli said. She told me the drives were inside and told me Sandra Marsh's name and said Denver. She said run east and then north. She said find someone big and scary because scary people are sometimes the only ones who tell the truth. And then she walked me to the back door of the motel. There was a car parked in the lot, a gray one, not the black sedan. She looked at it, and then she looked at me, and she held me in a way she had never held me before. Her arms stayed a second longer than they ever had, like she was memorizing the weight of me. And then she walked out the front door, and they followed her, and I went out the back, and I didn't stop. The room was very still. She drew them off you, Ryder said quietly. Eli nodded. Once. The smallest possible motion. She was brave, Ryder said. It was not a comfort. It was a fact, and the boy deserved facts. She was scared, Eli said. I could feel her hands shaking when she held me. She was trying not to let me feel it, but I could. Her hands were shaking and her voice wasn't. Being brave and being scared are the same thing, Ryder said. Eli looked at him. One tear ran down his face, one single track from eye to jaw. He let it fall. She wasn't alone at the end, Ryder said. She had you. She had everything she built. She had the work she did and the choice she made, and a son who ran 3 days through the desert to make sure it mattered. Eli's shoulder came to rest against Ryder's arm, not collapsing into him, just touching. The specific contact of someone who has run out of distance to put between themselves and another person and has decided finally to stop trying. Ryder let him. They sat that way for a long time while the fire burned and the mountain dripped outside and the dawn completed itself without any particular fanfare the way dawn usually does. 4 hours later, the sound of engines reached the cabin. Not one engine, many. A deep, rolling thunder building from the south, growing louder as it climbed, filling the spaces between the trees and bouncing off the rock faces until it seemed to be coming from everywhere simultaneously. A vibration you felt in your back teeth before you heard it properly, in your sternum, in the soles of your feet, on the wooden floor. Ryder stepped outside. The morning sun had burned through what remained of the overcast, throwing clean light across the wet forest. Steam rose from the ground in thin columns wherever the sun found a patch of dark earth. Water dripped from every surface with a sound like scattered applause. They came through the trees one by one. Harleys and one old Indian that sounded like it was held together by stubbornness alone. 9 bikes in loose formation, their chrome catching the light in flashes that moved through the tree line like signals. Their engines dropped to a synchronized idle as they entered the clearing, a sound that settled into the chest and stayed there. And then one by one the engines died, and the silence that replaced them was filled immediately by the sounds the engines had been drowning out. The creak of cooling metal, the shift of leather, the sound of boots finding ground. Forge came first, 6 feet 3 inches and built the way foundry workers are built, which is to say with a specific kind of mass that isn't about appearance, but about what the work demands over years. His head was shaved. His beard was iron gray, trimmed closer than Ryder remembered. His eyes beneath brows that had their own opinions about everything were the color of old coffee, and they found Ryder standing in the doorway of the ranger station with the unhurried precision of something that had been pointed at this exact location for hours. Behind Forge, the others dismounted. Ryder recognized some faces. Callan Reeves, who everyone called Patch, the club's medic, a man who had sewn up more field wounds than most emergency room doctors would see across a full career. His hands were always steady, and his eyes always carried a specific sadness, the residue of everyone he hadn't been able to get there in time for. Cade Merritt, who everyone called Wraith, quiet and lean, with the combat reflexes of someone who had learned very young that the difference between alive and not alive was usually about 3/4 of a second, and whether you had spent those 3/4 of a second paying attention. Bo Garrett, who everyone called Anvil, massive and red-bearded with forearms that looked structural and an expression currently occupying the difficult territory between old anger and older grief. And then a face Ryder hadn't expected. Jenna Cole, standing beside a black Sportster stripped to its working essentials, pulling off riding gloves with the methodical precision of someone who approaches most things the way a surgeon approaches a procedure. 35 years old with short dark hair and a scar running from her left eyebrow to her hairline, the permanent souvenir of a roadside device in Mosul that had killed 2 people in her squad and left her with a titanium plate in her skull and a medical discharge she hadn't asked for and didn't accept gracefully. She was not a patch member of the Iron Veil. She was something adjacent to that, an ally, a person the club called on when the situation exceeded the ordinary, a woman who rode with them when the cause was worth riding for. She was also the last person Ryder had been close to before he burned everything down. Jenna looked across the clearing at him. Her expression was controlled in the specific way that only people who have trained themselves to control it under extreme conditions can manage. Not cold, not warm, calibrated. A sniper's patience applied to the face. Ryder's stomach tightened. Forge crossed the clearing. He moved the way he always moved, each step a statement, stopping 4 feet from Ryder and looking at him the way you look at a piece of machinery you once trusted completely and are now trying to determine whether what's wrong with it is fixable or fundamental. "You look like hell," Forge said. "I know, you eating, when I remember." Forge's jaw moved. He looked past Ryder into the cabin, and Eli was there in the doorway, half behind the frame, watching the assembled bikers with eyes that missed nothing. He was still wearing Ryder's leather jacket, the hem of it reaching past his knees. Something changed in Forge's face. The operational hardness remained because it always remained. It was structural, it was load-bearing. But something arrived beneath it. Something that lived in the part of a man that has carried wounded civilians out of rubble and sat with the dying in field hospitals and come home to a country that didn't want to know about any of it. "That's the boy," Forge said. "That's him." Forge walked to the doorway. He folded himself down, a large man making himself smaller, and looked at Eli at eye level. No smile, no performance of gentleness. He just looked the way a man looks at something he has already decided to protect and is now taking inventory of what that protection will require. "You hungry?" Forge said. Eli nodded. Forge reached into his vest and produced a Snickers bar, held it out. Eli took it. Their fingers didn't touch. "Nobody's going to hurt you," Forge said. "Not while we're standing." He didn't say it gently. He said it the way he gave orders, with the flat, absolute certainty of a man who has never said a thing he didn't intend to follow through on, because the cost of saying things you don't mean is paid by other people. Eli looked at Forge, then at Ryder, then back at Forge. Then he nodded. Forge stood and turned back to Ryder. Whatever had briefly occupied his face was gone, replaced by the operational focus that Ryder recognized from pre-mission briefings in forward operating bases, the specific kind of attention that exists only when the time for deciding is finished and the time for doing has begun. "Talk to me," Forge said. Ryder gave him everything. The diner, Weston, the sedan, the chase up the mountain, the cabin, the drives, Judge Harlan Voss, Sandra Marsh in Denver, the cleaners, the backpack's contents as Eli had described them. The other bikers gathered as he spoke, forming a loose half circle. Patch crouched and cleaned his fingernails with a pocket knife, a habit Ryder remembered from bases in Afghanistan. Wraith stood apart from the group, scanning the tree line at regular intervals, watching the road. Anvil listened with his arms crossed and his face darkening in the specific way that a man's face darkens when the information arriving is worse than what he prepared himself for. Jenna stood at the edge of the group and didn't look at Ryder. She looked at Eli. When Ryder finished, Forge was quiet long enough for the forest to reassert itself around them. "The drives," Forge said. "You've looked at them. No laptop. So you're running on the word of an 8-year-old. I'm running on what I saw in a man's eyes in that diner. He was a professional forge. The way he moved, the way he managed the room. That wasn't a custody attorney. Forge looked at Jenna. She was already opening the saddlebag on her Sportster and removing a ruggedized laptop military spec, the kind built for environments where ordinary equipment stops working. Jenna pulled out the folded note from Eli's backpack. Handwritten, careful script names and dates and dollar amounts, and at the bottom a single line that had seemed like a personal notation. She read it, typed the phrase into the password field. The drive unlocked. Files populated the screen, dozens of them. Audio recordings, photographs taken from a distance, scanned documents, financial spreadsheets with entries going back 4 years, a folder labeled simply transfers. Jenna opened the first audio file. A man's voice filled the space between them, measured and authoritative speaking, with the casual confidence of someone who has never been recorded doing anything he shouldn't, and has consequently stopped imagining that he ever will be. The pipeline has backed it up. We need to move 30 units by the 15th or the buyer's walk. Tell Garza to use the warehouse in Las Cruces and make sure the documentation is clean. I don't want another situation like Roswell. Units. The words sat in the clearing like something that had just been set on fire. That's Voss, Jenna said quietly. She had found a photograph, a judicial portrait, formal robes, and American flag. She held it up. An ordinary face, the kind of face you would walk past at a grocery store without registering. Gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, a smile that was practiced and pleasant and gave nothing away. Jenna kept scrolling, opened the spreadsheet. Hundreds of entries, columns of dates and locations and amounts flowing through shell companies with names like Desert Bloom, Charitable Trust, and Rio Vista Consulting. She scrolled further. Names attached to the transactions began to appear, and some of them were not unfamiliar. A state senator, a district attorney in El Paso, a retired federal agent. Names that carried weight in the specific way that names attached to institutional authority always carry weight, names that made people believe them when they said there was nothing to see. And then Jenna stopped scrolling. Her breathing changed. A slight acceleration, barely perceptible to tell of someone who has just looked into a depth they weren't prepared for. She looked up at Forge. There's a name here, she said. Forge's expression didn't change. Tell me. Sheriff Boyd Creel, Doña Ana County. The clearing went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Forge stood very still. Ryder watched him absorb the name and what it meant. Watch the calculation happen behind his eyes. Watch the moment it finished calculating and arrived somewhere that changed the set of his shoulders. Forge turned to the window of the cabin and looked out at the trees. Creel came to the clubhouse, he said, 18 months ago. He came to me personally. He said he was building a task force focused on trafficking in the border corridor. He said he needed community partners. He said the Iron Veil had a reputation for protecting people who the system had failed, and he wanted our help in identifying operations. Nobody spoke. I met with him twice, Forge said. I gave him information. Routes we had heard about, locations we believed were being used. He stopped. His hands were on the back of a chair, his knuckles whitening. And the names of 2 women who had come to the club looking for help. Survivors. They had gotten out and they had nowhere to go, and they came to us because we were the only ones they thought might actually do something. I gave their names to Creel because he said his task force could get them into federal witness protection. Where are they now? Ryder said. Forge turned from the window. The answer was already in his eyes before it reached his mouth. I don't know, he said. I followed up twice. Creel said the process was ongoing, that these things took time. I stopped asking because I trusted the process. Anvil said it flatly, without drama, with the blunt certainty of a man who understood exactly how these operations worked and what happened to people who became inconvenient to them. They're dead. The word fell into the clearing and didn't echo. It just landed. Forge's fist came down on the back of the chair. Not a dramatic gesture, a spasm, the involuntary physical expression of something happening inside him that had no other way out. The chair shuddered. A coffee mug jumped and didn't fall. No one moved. Because every man present recognized the sound for what it was. Not anger, grief. The specific grief of a man who has just understood that a thing he did with good intentions became the instrument of someone else's murder. "This is on me," Forge said. "This is on," Creel Ryder said. "This is on Voss. This is on every name on those drives. I gave them the names. You were deceived by someone who came to you with a badge and a legitimate sounding cause. That's not the same thing." "I was the president," Forge said. His voice had dropped to something quiet and absolute. "It was my job not to be deceived." The argument had nowhere to go because both things were true simultaneously, and the truth of one didn't cancel the truth of the other. Forge had been manipulated by a corrupt sheriff who had used the club's own moral code as the weapon. The culpability belonged to Creel. The responsibility for not seeing it belonged to Forge. And the distance between culpability and responsibility was exactly wide enough for a man to fall into and not find the bottom. Forge walked to the porch. Ryder followed. They stood in the cold morning air, side by side, not looking at each other, looking out at the wet forest. "I'm sorry I called you a coward," Ryder said. "In front of everyone. I was right about Webb and wrong about the way I said it." Forge was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that holds things that have been waiting 3 years to be received. "You punished everyone for my mistake," Forge said. "Not just me. Every man who called you brother." "I know. That's what I needed to hear 3 years ago." "I know that too." Another silence. The forest dripped. A hawk called somewhere above the tree line, distant and indifferent. "You're going to have to earn your way back," Forge said. "Not today. After. But it won't be given to you. I'm not asking for it to be given." Forge nodded once. Then he went back inside and the door closed behind him, and the space between them had changed in some way that didn't have a name yet but would eventually become one. Jenna kept working at the laptop. She opened more files, more recordings, more photographs, then one that made her stop. An outdoor photograph taken from some distance, slightly grainy. 4 men at a table at what appeared to be a restaurant patio. Judge Voss, Sheriff Creel, a third man in a suit whose face matched one of the executive names from the financial documents, and a fourth. "Ryder," Jenna said. Her voice had dropped to something that was almost not a voice at all. He crossed the room and looked at the screen and looked at the fourth man and felt the ground shift beneath him in a way that had nothing to do with the physical world. Dale Weston, not standing in the background, not hovering at the edge of the frame. Sitting at the table with the principal architects of the operation, his body language relaxed, his posture comfortable, his expression the same pleasant professional composure he had worn in the diner. The posture of a man among colleagues, among partners, among people who trusted each other the way people trust each other in a shared enterprise that has been running smoothly for a very long time. "There's a file on him," Jenna said. She opened it. A personnel record. The name at the top was not Dale Weston. It was Dale Weston listed as an alias. The actual name was different. The actual history was different. Former Army intelligence. 2 tours. Discharged under other than honorable conditions, the specific reasons redacted in a way that told you more about what they were than any explicit language could have. Post-military employment with a private security firm whose client list was the kind that didn't appear in public filings. "He's not a cleaner," Jenna said. Her voice was level and precise, and underneath it was something that had hardened all the way through. "He's a handler. He designed and runs the operational security for the entire network. The cleaners report to him." Ryder stood at the laptop and let the full architecture of it assemble itself in his mind. Weston wasn't chasing them because a judge had given him an order. He was chasing them because the evidence in Eli's backpack threatened something he had personally built over more than a decade. This wasn't an assignment. This was his life's work. And a man defending his life's work operates at a different level of commitment than a man running an errand. "We can't go to the police," Ryder said. We couldn't go to the police before, Wraith said from the corner, his voice quiet and precise as always. Now there's a federal judge and a county sheriff in those files. The police don't go to the police with something like this. They call the judge. So we go to the reporter, Forge said. We go to the reporter, Ryder said. But first we get off this mountain. Then at 4 in the morning, Wraith returned from the perimeter with a piece of paper in his hand. The expression on his face was the thing that moved through the group before he said a word. Cade Merritt had a face that gave away very little. Years of operating in environments where your face was as much a tactical asset as your hands had made it that way. But something had gotten through. Something in what he had picked up on Maggie's satellite radio, which she had given them access to, had gotten through the training and reached whatever lived underneath it. He found Forge. They spoke quietly for 30 seconds. Then Forge turned and walked to Ryder's position, and his boots on the wooden floor sounded like a countdown. He opened the door and motioned outside. They stood on the cabin porch in the cold pre-dawn air, the mountains invisible in the darkness around them, the stars overhead thick and brilliant and indifferent. A federal warrant has been issued, Forge said. For who? Forge handed him the paper. Wraith's handwriting tight and angular, the transcription of a radio alert that had been running for the past 2 hours on every law enforcement frequency between New Mexico and the Colorado border. Ryder Callahan, kidnapping, interstate transportation of a minor, assault, fleeing law enforcement. He read the description. Dangerous former Marine with a documented history of violent episodes and substance abuse. Unstable. Armed. The concerned Uncle Dale Weston described as having attempted to peacefully recover his nephew before being threatened by the abductor. The narrative was architecturally perfect. Every fact technically present. Every fact arranged in a configuration that produced a complete lie. The diner, the storm, the motorcycle, the boy. All of it inverted, all of it turned inside out, until the man who had wrapped his jacket around a cold child and pulled him out of a parking lot became the predator, and the predator became the victim. An Amber Alert with Eli's face was running on every highway sign and every news feed between Flagstaff and the Colorado border. Ryder lowered the paper. They didn't just close our path, he said. They turned the whole country into the cage. Forge looked at him in the darkness, and what lived in his expression in that moment was the recognition of a man who has just understood that the situation he rode into is categorically different from the situation he was told about. More connected, more resourced, more willing. Every law enforcement agency in 3 states is looking for you, Forge said. They have your name, your description, your plate number. They have Eli's face on every screen in the western United States. Any officer who stops us runs the plate, and it's over. They take the boy. They take the evidence. And Voss's people will be at whatever station we're taken to before the paperwork is filed. The mountains were enormous and dark around them. The stars offered nothing. Then we don't get stopped, Ryder said. Forge looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned and went back inside, and his voice, when it came through the open door, carried the weight of a man who has made a calculation that doesn't leave room for the alternatives. Nobody sleeps, Forge said. We plan, and we move before first light. They planned through what remained of the night. Maggie Thorne spread paper maps across the kitchen table, real maps printed from Forest Service databases and annotated in her own precise hand over years of living in this terrain. She traced a route through the Uncompahgre National Forest that avoided every town, every highway, every cell tower she knew about. The route would add 16 hours to any reasonable estimate of travel time. It would require riding on logging tracks that hadn't seen maintenance in 2 decades. From the western slope near Montrose, she said you can take back roads to Gunnison, over Monarch Pass and down into the Front Range. You come out southwest of Denver, the opposite direction from what they'll be watching. Forge studied the maps the way he studied everything, with total attention and no visible reaction until the attention had finished its work. What about the reporter, he said. Sandra Marsh, Ryder said. Denver Independent. Eli's mother was supposed to meet her before this started. We can't walk into a newsroom with a child and a backpack full of evidence on a federal judge. Jenna said it without looking up from the laptop. If Voss knew about Rachel Mercer's plan to go to the press, he may know about Marsh. If he knows about Marsh, the paper is already being watched. Then we verify before we go anywhere near her, Forge said. Jenna, when we get close to Denver, you make contact. Feel her out. If she's clean, we deliver. If she's not, we find someone else. There's a second option, Ryder said. The room looked at him. We split the evidence. 3 drives, 3 separate paths. Jenna and Cade take 1 drive to Marsh and proceed to whatever handoff she can arrange. Colt and Harris take the 2nd drive south to Buena Vista to the prosecutor Maggie mentioned. We keep the 3rd. If both paths get shut down, we release it ourselves. Every outlet, every platform, everything at once. A flood they can't contain. Forge was quiet for a moment. If Torres at the U.S. Attorney's Office is clean, Jenna said 1 drive through Marsh gets us federal protection within 48 hours. If Torres is compromised, we still have 2 other paths running simultaneously. And if all 3 fail, Ryder said the 3rd drive goes to every server Jenna can access and every journalist in her network. We lose control of the story, but the story gets out. They can't kill what's already everywhere. Forge looked at Ryder across the table. Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise, recognition. The specific recognition of a man seeing something return that he had believed was gone. Welcome back, Forge said quietly. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't forgiveness. It was the acknowledgement of a man who respected competence above most other things and was watching it reassert itself after a long absence. They spent the next hour working through contingencies. Routes, fuel stops, communication protocols, emergency fallback positions. Forge sent Wraith and Deacon south as decoys before dawn, 2 bikes heading back toward the highway, loud and visible drawing attention away from the main formation's departure. At 3 in the morning, Ryder stepped outside for air. Jenna was sitting on the porch step with a cigarette burning between her fingers and her face turned up toward the stars. He sat beside her. The boards were cold through his jeans. The night smelled of pine and horse and the distant metallic edge of snow on the high peaks. You're going into Denver tomorrow, he said. I know where I'm going. Jenna. She looked at him. The cigarette glowed, casting brief light across the scar above her eye, the sharp line of her jaw, the expression that was neither open nor closed, but something calibrated between them. The expression of a woman who has learned to carry damage without letting it set the direction. Don't say be careful, she said. I hate that. I was going to say I'm sorry. For what specifically? The screen door, the drinking, showing up at your apartment at 3 in the morning, the way I left. All of it. Jenna took a long drag and exhaled slowly. The smoke rose and dissolved into the cold air without leaving any trace of itself behind. You were drowning, she said. I knew that when it was happening. I tried to pull you out and you kicked me in the process. That's what drowning people do. It doesn't make it acceptable, but it makes it something other than purely personal. That's more grace than I've earned. Probably. She crushed the cigarette under her boot. But I've got enough damage of my own without carrying yours on top of it. Get the kids safe, Ryder. That's the only apology that means anything to me now. She stood and went inside, and the door closed behind her, and Ryder sat alone on the porch step and looked up at the stars. Something moved through him that had no comfortable name. Not hope. Hope was too light for what this was. This was heavier. The specific weight of a man who has just discovered he is afraid again, which means he has something worth being afraid for. For 3 years, he had ridden with nothing at stake. No relationships, no obligations, no one who would register his absence. That emptiness had felt like freedom. It had actually been a very slow way of disappearing while still technically being present. Now there was Eli. Now there was the brotherhood, however fractured, however much remained to be repaired. Now there was a promise made to a boy in a ranger station and a second promise made at a different moment that carried the same weight. The fear was enormous. Underneath it, barely audible, something that felt like being alive again. Dawn came without ceremony. Gray light finding the mountain peaks first and working its way down. The horses in Maggie's corral moved in the early cold. Someone had already started coffee. The formation gathered in the driveway at first light. 9 bikes, 9 riders, 1 boy. Forge didn't give a speech. He was not that kind of leader and never had been. He looked at each person individually, a moment of direct eye contact that said everything a speech would have made smaller. Then he put on his helmet and swung onto his bike, and the formation began to move. It divided cleanly at the end of Maggie's driveway. Jenna and Cade Merritt went east, 2 bikes accelerating quickly onto the county road, carrying the first drive toward Denver. Colton Harris went south toward Buena Vista, carrying the second drive to North Aldridge. Ryder watched them go and felt the drives leaving like something physical, like weight redistributed across a structure that was being tested. Ryder lifted Eli onto his own bike this time. Not Patch's Road King, his. The boy settled behind him and his arms came around Ryder's waist and locked without being told. And Ryder felt the specific, impossible weight of that grip, the trust compressed into it, the decision that had been made and remade every hour of the past 3 days to keep trusting when every reasonable calculation said not to. They went west into the national forest. The logging roads were exactly as brutal as Maggie had warned. Rutted channels where runoff had carved itself new paths. Sections where the surface had washed out entirely and left behind loose rock that shifted under the tires like something deliberately hostile. Fallen branches across the track at intervals that required stopping and moving them by hand. The temperature dropped as they gained elevation, the air thinning, the pines crowding closer. Ryder's Softail was not built for this terrain and made no pretense of being otherwise. It bottomed out on the third major washboard, the frame connecting with embedded rock hard enough to send a shock through his spine from his tailbone to his skull. He absorbed it, adjusted his line, kept moving. Eli made no sound, just held on and leaned when Ryder leaned and trusted the machine to do what it was being asked to do, even when the machine was clearly operating beyond its design tolerances. Pike went down at the crossing of a creek swollen with snowmelt. His front wheel found a submerged rock. The bike twisted sideways and he went into the water on his back with a sound like something structural giving way. He was upright before anyone could get to him, soaked from the waist down, limping on his left ankle, pulling the bike out of the current with the specific fury of a man who has been embarrassed in front of people whose opinion he values. "You good," Forge said. "I'm wet," Pike said. "That's not what I asked. I'm good." They kept moving. At 9,000 feet, Forge signaled and the formation stopped in a natural clearing ringed by rock outcroppings and mature pines. Open sightlines in every direction. The bikes lined up along the tree line, and the riders dismounted with the collective stiffness of people who had been absorbing punishment for 5 hours. Patch went to Eli immediately. Temperature, pulse, hydration, the way a medic moves when he has been tracking a patient's reserves in his head and is now checking his accounting against reality. He made the boy eat an energy bar and drink water from a thermos, and then sat him on a fallen log in a patch of sunlight. Ryder sat beside him. Neither spoke for a while. The forest held them in the kind of quiet that exists above a certain elevation, stripped of human noise, wind in the trees, and the distant sound of running water, and nothing else. "Something happened," Eli said. "This morning, before we left." Everyone's face was different. "You won't look at me the same way." Ryder had been preparing for this since the mountain, had been turning it over during 5 hours of writing, trying to find the arrangement of words that could carry the truth without collapsing under the weight of it. There was no such arrangement. "Your mother isn't coming back, Eli." He said it simply, without preamble, without softening, because the boy in front of him had walked through a desert storm and chosen a stranger and whispered 5 words that changed everything, and he deserved the same directness he had given. Eli didn't move, didn't blink. His face went absolutely still, the surface of it flat and perfect the way a lake goes, still before the wind finds it. "I know," he said, 2 words, And in them, the entire weight of a grief that had been carried alone for 3 days, examined in motel rooms and truck cabs, in the backs of delivery vehicles, accepted without witness because there had been no one to witness it. I knew when she walked out the door, Eli said, the way she held me before she went. Her arms stayed a second longer than they ever had, like she was memorizing the weight of me. I could feel it even then. Ryder's chest constricted. He breathed through it, controlled and deliberate, refusing to let his own response crowd out the space the boy needed. She was brave, Ryder said. The bravest person I've ever heard of. She was scared, Eli said. I could feel her hands shaking when she held me. She tried not to let me feel it, but I could. Her hands were shaking, and her voice wasn't. Being brave and being scared are the same thing, Ryder said. Eli looked at him. A single tear ran from the corner of his eye to his jaw. He let it fall. She went to everyone, Eli said. His voice was thin but steady. 2 years. She went to the police and the lawyers and the people at the state level and the people at the federal level. They all said the same things, that she was confused, that she was misreading what she saw, that the judge was a respected man and she should be careful about making accusations she couldn't support. She kept going back with more evidence, and they kept finding reasons why it wasn't enough. He stopped, his hands were quiet in his lap, and then she found the recordings, he said. And she knew. She knew she wasn't wrong, and she knew that meant she had run out of people to go to. So she went to Sandra Marsh instead. We're going to get you to Denver, Ryder said. We're going to get those drives to Marsh, and then we're going to find out what happened to your mother. That's not a maybe. That's what comes next. Promise, the word hung between them in the mountain air. I already made you one promise, Ryder said. Eli looked at him with those steady, ancient eyes measuring. Same promise, Ryder said. Same man making it. Eli's shoulder came to rest against Ryder's arm. Just the weight of it. Just the contact. And they sat that way in the sunlight while the bikers around them ate and rested and checked their machines, and the forest held them both in its enormous, indifferent, ancient peace. At 1 in the afternoon, Colt's voice came through on the satellite phone, one call 30 seconds. Delivered, Colt said. Aldridge has the drive. She's already making calls. But Forge, there are 2 vehicles that came out of nowhere about 10 minutes after we made the handoff. We're heading into the mountains. I can lose them, but I'm not coming back to you without bringing them along. Don't come back, Forge said. Lose them and go to ground. Call when you're clear. The line went dead. One path confirmed, one path under pressure. The third drive in Ryder's jacket pocket, pressing against his chest, its weight entirely disproportionate to its size. They rode down from the high country through the afternoon. The descent was faster than the ascent, and harder in different ways. The bikes fighting gravity on grades that had no business being navigated at the speeds the situation demanded. The temperature climbed as they lost elevation. The terrain softened. By late afternoon, they were on pavement again, county roads winding through ranch country in the valley below Monarch Pass. They moved through small towns without stopping. Ryder kept his visor down. Eli stayed pressed close against his back, invisible from a distance, beneath the borrowed helmet and the bulk of Ryder's jacket still wrapped around his shoulders. At 6 in the evening, Forge signaled and the formation pulled off the highway onto a gravel lot behind a motel called the Mountain View. 12 rooms, 1 story, a vacancy sign that appeared to be permanently illuminated, the kind of establishment that processed transactions in cash without requiring anything in writing. Forge went inside alone, came back with keys to 3 rooms paid for, in full, no names recorded. They put Eli in the center room with Ryder on one side and Forge on the other. The remaining brothers spread across the parking lot in positions that appeared casual and were not the practiced geometry of men who had learned that security was most effective when it was invisible. At 7 o'clock, a pickup truck pulled into the lot and Jenna stepped out of the passenger side. Beside her was a woman in her mid-40s, dark hair, pulled back canvas jacket, a messenger bag over one shoulder, moving with the tight, focused energy of someone who had not slept properly in a week and had stopped expecting to. Sandra Marsh. Ryder watched her cross the parking lot and cataloged everything. The way her eyes moved quick and systematic, the set of her jaw, the absence of performance in how she carried herself. He was looking for the tells of deception, the micro expressions of someone playing a role they hadn't fully learned. He found none. What he found was exhaustion and determination in the specific controlled anxiety of a journalist who knows the story of her lifetime is 30 feet away and is terrified that something will go wrong before she can file it. Forge met her at the door. "You're the president," Marsh said. "Not a question. I'm the man who decides whether you see what's on those drives. And I'm the woman who can make sure the people who killed Rachel Mercer go to prison. So maybe we move past the posturing and talk about how to actually do that." Forge looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped aside. The meeting happened in Ryder's room. Marsh sat at the small table. Jenna opened the laptop. Ryder stood by the window. Forge leaned against the wall beside the door. Eli sat cross-legged on the bed with his backpack beside him, watching everything. Marsh looked at Eli. Something crossed her face, grief and fury arriving simultaneously, a combination that people who have spent their careers documenting what humans do to each other learn to recognize and never learn to be comfortable with. "You look like your mother," Marsh said. "You knew her," Eli said. "We spoke 4 times by phone. She was the most determined person I have spoken to in 20 years of doing this work. She knew exactly what she had and exactly what it would cost, and she went forward anyway." "She's dead," Eli said. Flat. The wound too deep now for inflection. "I know, I'm sorry. Being sorry doesn't fix anything." "No, but publishing the truth might." Eli looked at her for a long moment, measuring her against whatever internal standard he had developed over 3 days and a lifetime of watching adults fail to do what they said they would. Then he reached into his backpack and placed the 3 USB drives on the table between them. "These are my mom's," he said. "She died for them. So you better be who you say you are." Marsh picked up the red drive, held it in her palm, closed her fingers around it. "I am," she said. They spent 2 hours going through the files. Marsh worked with the methodical intensity of someone for whom this was not intellectual exercise, but obligation. She listened to audio clips with earbuds in and took notes in dense shorthand that filled 3 pages of a yellow legal pad. She cross-referenced names against a database on her own laptop. She asked Jenna precise technical questions about file provenance and chain of custody. At 9 o'clock, she pulled her earbuds out and set them on the table. Her face had changed. The exhaustion was still there, but underneath it, something that burned at a controlled, sustainable heat. "This is enough," she said. "The recordings alone would be sufficient for a federal investigation. Combined with the financial records and the personnel files, this is a prosecution. A significant one." She looked at Forge. "I have a contact at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Denver, Megan Torres. I've known her for 15 years. She's not connected to Voss's network. If I give her this, she can convene a grand jury within a week." Ryder said it before Forge could. "How do you know Torres is clean?" Marsh held his gaze. "I don't know with certainty, but I know her. I know how she operates. I know what she has put at risk in her career to do the right thing in situations where the right thing was the expensive choice." "No calls from this location," Forge said. "Nothing traceable back here. There's a payphone 3 miles east." Marsh nodded. She stood and put her legal pad in her bag and looked at Eli one more time. "Your mother's work is going to matter," she said. "I want you to know that." Eli looked at her steadily. "Then make it matter," he said. Forge sent Wraith to accompany Marsh to the payphone. They left in the pickup truck, and the parking lot settled back into the particular quiet of people waiting for something they cannot control. Ryder sat on the bed beside Eli. "She seemed real," Eli said. "She is real." "How do you know?" "Because she looked at you the way your mother's friends would look at you. Not with pity, with anger. Anger at the people who did this to your family. That kind of anger isn't something you perform." Eli lay back on the bed. His eyes found the ceiling. The heater hummed. From the room next door came the low murmur of voices, Forge and Anvil and Patch, talking through contingencies in the methodical way of men who have learned that preparation is the only thing you can actually control. What happens to me, Eli said. We get through tomorrow, then we figure out the rest. That's not an answer. I know. Ryder, yeah, don't leave. 2 words. The same weight as the 5 he had whispered in the diner. Not a request. A need. The raw, exposed need of a child who has lost everything and found one thing and is holding it with everything he has left. I'm not leaving, Ryder said. Eli closed his eyes. His breathing slowed and deepened, and within minutes he was gone. Whatever guard he maintained in waking hours finally released by exhaustion, too complete to resist. Ryder sat in the dark room and listened to the parking lot sounds, the low voices of brothers, the click of a lighter, the occasional creak of a bike's frame cooling in the night air, the sounds of the iron veil doing what it had always done at its best, standing between the people it protected and everything that wanted to reach them. At 11 o'clock, Wraith returned alone. His face was wrong. The controlled neutrality that was Cade Merritt's natural state had been replaced by something tighter, something that had come through the training and reached what lived underneath. He found Forge in the parking lot. Ryder watched through the window as they spoke, 2 silhouettes in the sodium lamp's orange light, Wraith's hands moving in the precise way he moved them when he was conveying tactical information. Forge's head dropped. Then Forge turned and walked toward Ryder's room with steps that sounded deliberate in a way that made Ryder's stomach tighten before the door opened. Forge looked at Eli sleeping, motioned Ryder outside. They stood in the cold parking lot. The mountains were invisible in the darkness. The stars overhead were dense and brilliant and entirely indifferent. Marsh made the call, Forge said. Torres said she'd take the evidence. She said she'd move fast. She asked Marsh for our location, said she needed to send federal marshals for the handoff standard protective protocol. Ryder waited. Marsh didn't give it, Forge said. Something felt wrong, the way Torres asked. Too quickly, too specifically, like she already knew there was a location to ask about. If Torres is compromised, then the moment we hand over the drives through that channel, they disappear. The evidence disappears. Every name in those files walks free. And Rachel Mercer died for nothing. Forge rubbed his palm across his shaved head. The sound of it was very loud in the quiet. There's another path, Ryder said. Forge looked at him. Nora Aldridge in Buena Vista. Colt confirmed she has the second drive. She's already making calls to journalists she trusts and a civil rights attorney with a national profile. If we go to her directly with the third drive, while Marsh continues pursuing Torres carefully, they can't shut down both paths simultaneously. And if both paths get compromised, then I upload the third drive to every server Jenna gave me access to, and we release it all at once to every outlet that will carry it. We lose control of the story, but control of the story is already something we never really had. Forge was quiet for a long moment. They'll have every major route into Denver covered, he said. If Torres is dirty and she's already made calls, they'll be watching every highway corridor. Then we don't come in from the direction they're watching. The satellite phone, Forge said. If they have access to cell tower records from your call on the ridge, they may have been tracking the satellite phone as well. Ryder felt it before Forge finished the sentence. The cold, specific understanding of a trap closing from a direction you hadn't looked. Maggie's phone, Ryder said. They went inside. Forge took the satellite phone apart, separated the battery, and ran his fingers along the interior housing. He found it in 30 seconds. A passive tracker, smaller than the first, wedged between the battery and the case wall, a device that transmitted nothing on its own, but responded to a directional ping with its precise location. They had it from the moment Maggie handed it over, which meant Weston had known their position at Maggie's ranch, had known their direction of travel, had been feeding their movements forward to whatever assets he had positioned ahead of them. Forge set the phone on the kitchen table and looked at it. He's been running us, Forge said. Not chasing us, running us, letting us move while he positioned what he needed in front of us. How long? since Shiprock at the latest, maybe longer. Ryder thought about Weston at the table in that photograph. His posture, the relaxed certainty of a man who has never operated from a position of reactive panic. Who builds systems? Who thinks in terms of what happens after what happens after what happens? He's not trying to stop us here, Ryder said. He's trying to funnel us into Denver under conditions he controls, where he has law enforcement assets in a kidnapping warrant and the infrastructure to make everything we carry disappear. Forge crushed the tracker under his boot. The LED died. We don't go to Denver the way he expects us to, Forge said. No, Ryder said. We go the way he can't cover. The plan they built in the next 2 hours was simple in structure and demanding in execution. At first light, the formation would move west into the foothills to Anvil's hunting cabin 20 miles from Golden with clear sight lines and a single access road. Jenna would proceed independently toward Denver and make contact with Marsh to coordinate timing. Nora Aldridge in Buena Vista would be the primary delivery path, with Marsh as the secondary through whatever channel she could establish that didn't run through Torres. The third drive would stay with Ryder. If both paths were shut down, the upload would happen from the cabin, from Jenna's equipment, broadcasting to every server and outlet simultaneously. 3 paths, 3 chances. One of them had to hold. Nobody slept that night. The bikers spread through the rooms in the parking lot and the spaces between cleaning machines and checking gear and talking in the low, careful voices of people who have accepted what the morning will bring and stopped trying to negotiate with it. Dawn arrived gray and cold, the mountains emerging from darkness in stages. The formation gathered one final time in the parking lot. Forge didn't speak. He looked at each rider once. Then he started his engine, and the formation moved. Jenna split off first, her Sportster heading east at speed, carrying one drive and the weight of everything that depended on what she would find when she got there. Ryder watched her go until the bike disappeared around the curve of the highway, and the sound of her engine faded into the general noise of the morning. Eli's arms tightened around his waist. Ryder put one hand briefly over the boy's clasped hands. Then both hands went back to the grips, and he rolled the throttle forward, and the Harley surged and they went west into the foothills, with the sun coming up behind them, throwing their shadow, long and thin, across the road ahead. Anvil's cabin appeared at the end of a dirt road flanked by Douglas firs, a log structure with a stone chimney and a tin roof and the weathered solidity of something built to outlast the people who built it. Good sight lines north and south, one way in and one way out. They settled in. Deacon and Pike took elevated positions with binoculars. Anvil covered the access road. Forge and Ryder and Patch stayed inside with Eli. The satellite phone, now clean of its tracker, sat on the kitchen table like a stone waiting to fall. At 10:45 it rang. Forge answered, listened without speaking. His face gave nothing away. He listened for 23 seconds and set the phone down. Weather, he said. The word detonated in the small room. Torres was waiting, Forge said. Not with Marshall's, with Voss's people. Jenna made them before the handoff. Wrong positions, wrong body language, wrong everything. She pulled out. The drive is still with her. She's mobile heading west. Eli's grip on his backpack tightened. Patch put his hand on the boy's shoulder. Ryder looked at Forge. First path down, second path under pressure somewhere in the mountains south of them. Third drive in his pocket. Then the radio on Deacon's position crackled. 3 vehicles on the access road, Deacon's voice said. Black SUVs, moving fast. Through the cabin window, Ryder could see the dust rising above the tree line to the east. 3 separate columns of it converging on their position with the unhurried inevitability of something that has been waiting for the right moment and believes it has found it. Weston, not the tracker they had found, something else they hadn't found, or simply the logic of a man who had been running them for 3 days and understood where they would eventually come to ground. Out the back, Forge said, Bikes, now. They moved through the cabin in 10 seconds. The back door opened onto the slope behind the structure. Bikes lined up against the tree line where they had been parked for concealment. Engines fired in sequence. The combined roar shattered the mountain silence and announced to everything within a mile that whatever patience had been maintained was finished. Eli was on Ryder's bike before anyone suggested it. His arms locked around Ryder's waist with the grip of someone who has decided that this is what holding on looks like and is prepared to hold on for as long as holding on is what's required. The first SUV cleared the front of the cabin as the formation cleared the back. Ryder saw in his mirror the vehicle's doors opening before it fully stopped. Men in dark clothing emerging with the coordinated efficiency of people who had done this before. And among them at the front, tall and unhurried as always, Dale Weston. His eyes found Ryder across the distance of the clearing, across the noise and the exhaust and the chaos of the chase beginning. And in that moment, the last pretense was gone. The pleasant professional face, the warm voice, the carefully constructed persona of a concerned relative, all of it had been a performance for the diner. What remained was the face of a man who had built something over a decade and was looking at the person who threatened to unmake it. The formation hit the logging road at the rear of the property and the trees swallowed them. Ryder rode with everything he had left, muscle memory and stubbornness and the weight of a boy on the back of the bike, and the specific clarifying knowledge that there was no longer any version of this that allowed for something less than everything. The road was brutal, and the bike fought it, and he fought the bike, and Eli held on, and the SUVs came behind them through the trees, slower on the terrain, their weight working against them on the grades and the loose rock, but advancing with the steady persistence of something that has made its calculation and is committed to the outcome. They broke out of the trees into an alpine meadow 300 yards across the grass, still wet from the storm, the peaks visible above the tree line on every side, under a sky that had finally gone blue. Forge led the formation into the clearing and turned, bringing the bikes around in a line facing east, facing the tree line, facing the road the SUVs were coming down. The first SUV emerged from the trees, then the second, then the third. They spread across the width of the meadow's entrance and stopped. Their engines idled. Their doors stayed closed. And then from the east, from the direction of the county road, a sound began to build. Not one engine, not two. A wall of sound layered and complex, built from dozens of distinct voices, all running at full throttle, growing louder with the unstoppable momentum of something that has been moving toward this point for hours and is not going to stop before it arrives. They poured into the meadow from two separate trails on its eastern edge, converging in a movement that filled the open ground with chrome and leather and the thunderous synchronized roar of bikes that had been running hard. 30 of them. 35. Veterans MC Alliance out of Colorado. Iron Ridge Brotherhood from Durango. A chapter from Fort Collins whose name was on patches Ryder didn't recognize. Independents who apparently owed someone a very significant favor. At the center of it, on a battered Heritage Softail, with mismatched pipes and a headlamp, held on by a determination that had outlasted the hardware, Jenna Cole brought her bike to a stop 20 feet from Forge and killed the engine. In the sudden relative quiet, her voice carried across the meadow without effort. "I made some calls," she said. Forge stared at her. "You said no calls." She met his eyes without flinching. "But you didn't make rules for when a child's life is the cost of following them. So I borrowed a payphone on the way out of Denver and called everyone I knew and told them to ride." She pulled off her helmet. Her scar caught the morning light. Her expression held the particular combination of calm and readiness that belongs to people who have made a decision they are entirely prepared to be accountable for. Forge looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked out at the meadow, at the riders who had filled it, men and women who had nothing at stake in this except the cause, who had come because someone asked and the asking was sufficient. His jaw unclenched. For the first time in 48 hours, the weight of it released. Weston made his decision and got out of his vehicle alone. He crossed the meadow with his hands at his sides, his tactical vest zipped his posture, carrying the professional composure of a man who is behind on points and knows it and is not yet finished. He stopped 20 feet from Ryder. "This is impressive," Weston said. He gestured at the assembled riders without urgency. "A real demonstration of community. But you need to understand what happens next. In approximately 40 minutes, a Colorado State Police tactical unit will be at this location responding to a federal kidnapping alert. When they arrive, they will see an armed fugitive in possession of a missing child surrounded by motorcycle gang members. The narrative is already written. Every camera in the state is looking for that boy's face and yours. He paused. You can't win this with numbers. Every person here is now an accessory. Every plate will be run. Every name flagged. You're not protecting the boy. You're burying yourselves and everyone who came to help you. His gaze moved to Ryder and stayed. Ryder stepped forward. 1 step. 2. Until he could see the individual lines of Weston's face clearly, the controlled breathing, the pupils fractionally wider than the light required. The man was afraid. Not of the riders, not of the numbers, of what was in the pocket of Ryder's jacket, of what had already left this location and was sitting in Nora Aldridge's hands, of the chain of events that had been set in motion 3 days ago by a woman who had walked out of a motel into headlights with shaking hands and steady feet. You're right about the state police, Ryder said. You're right about the warrant. You're right that every person here is at risk. He reached into his jacket and held up the red drive between his thumb and forefinger. But here's what you missed. The drives are already out. One is with a reporter, one is with a prosecutor, and this one is 30 seconds from being uploaded to every server and outlet Jenna has access to. He turned his head. Jenna. She held up the ruggedized tablet, its screen glowing in the morning light. Connected to a satellite uplink, one of the Fort Collins riders had brought in a saddlebag, a man who worked in network security and had brought equipment that turned the meadow into a mobile broadcast station. Files staged, Jenna said. 1 tap. From behind the line of riders, Nora Aldridge stepped forward. She had come up from Buena Vista in the early hours, brought by Colt when the pursuit on the mountain roads finally ended. She was small and moved with the contained authority of someone who had spent years walking into rooms that didn't want her there. She stopped 5 feet from Weston and looked up at him. I have your personnel file, Mr. Weston, she said. I have your financial records. I have recordings of your voice directing the operational logistics of a human trafficking network. A federal magistrate in the 10th Circuit outside Judge Voss's sphere of influence is preparing a counter warrant as we speak. Sheriff Boyd Creel was taken into custody 4 hours ago in Las Cruces on charges that will lead directly to his cooperation with federal investigators. U.S. Marshals, not state police. Not anyone connected to Voss are en route to this location to take custody of the evidence. She held his gaze with the patience of a woman who had been waiting 6 years for this specific morning. You have maybe 15 minutes to make a decision about what you want the rest of your life to look like. Weston looked at Ryder, at Jenna's tablet, at the 35 riders filling the meadow behind them, at Aldridge standing 5 feet away with a leather briefcase and the particular fearlessness of someone who has nothing left to lose because they already lost everything the first time around and survived it. And then he looked at Eli. The boy stood beside Patch at the edge of the formation, small, still wearing Ryder's jacket with the hem past his knees. His face was composed. His eyes were steady, the eyes of a child who had run 3 days across the desert and through the mountains and through the full weight of a system designed to make people like him disappear, and had decided somewhere along the way that running was finished and what came next was standing still and being seen. Weston turned, walked back to his vehicle. The door closed. The 3 SUVs reversed slowly across the wet grass, found the logging road, and disappeared into the tree line. Nobody cheered. Nobody exhaled in triumph. The departure was watched in the specific silence of people who understood that the threat had diminished but not ended, that the machinery of corruption could reassemble, that justice moved at its own speed, and sometimes that speed was insufficient. But it had moved. The U.S. Marshals arrived 37 minutes later. 2 marked vehicles, 4 deputies, a field coordinator, who moved with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been briefed extensively and wanted to be done with the briefing and into the doing. He spoke with Aldridge for several minutes, reviewed documents she produced from her briefcase, and took formal possession of the 3rd drive with the careful handling of a man who understood what he was holding. He approached Ryder. Mr. Callahan, the kidnapping warrant has been suspended pending review. You're not under arrest. You'll need to make yourself available for interviews. I understand. The boy will be placed in temporary protective custody while we work to identify family. He doesn't have family. The coordinator checked his file. We'll need to verify that. In the meantime, he'll be placed with a foster family under marshal protection in the Denver area. Ryder looked at Eli. The boy was standing beside Patch. Patch's hand was on his shoulder. Eli was watching Ryder with the full concentrated attention he gave everything reading the adult in front of him for information the adult wasn't saying out loud. Ryder crossed the meadow. He crouched in front of the boy until they were at the same height. I have to let them take you, he said. For now, it's the law, and right now the law needs to be on our side. You'll disappear, Eli said. I already made you one promise. That was different. Same man making it. Ryder held the boy's gaze. Denver, the reporter, the drives. Your mom's work finishes what she started. That's not a maybe, and neither is this. Eli looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. Small but definite, the nod of someone who has decided to extend trust one more time and has made the decision consciously with full knowledge of what trust has cost before. He turned and walked to the marshal's vehicle. He climbed in. He did not look back through the window as the vehicle pulled out of the meadow and onto the access road and away. He had learned somewhere across 3 days and 200 miles, and everything they had been through together, that looking back was what you did when you expected to lose something. He had decided to stop expecting that. Ryder stood in the meadow and watched the vehicle go. He stood there after it had disappeared and the sound of its engine had faded into the distance. The meadow began to empty around him as riders remounted, and engines started the thunder building, and then dispersing as the various chapters and independents went their separate ways back toward their separate lives. The space beside him where a boy had stood was the heaviest thing he had ever carried. Forge appeared at his shoulder. When it was quiet enough to hear the wind in the pines, Forge said Denver. Ryder nodded. And then we burn it down, Forge said. Every name on those drives, every face in those photographs, every person who made Rachel Mercer run and made her son carry what she left behind. We don't stop until there's nothing left that needs burning. Ryder walked to his Harley. He sat with the engine off for a moment, the meadow going quiet around him, the peaks catching the afternoon light on their snow-covered faces. Somewhere in Denver, a boy was riding in a vehicle toward a house he had never seen, carrying a grief he had never asked for, holding a promise made by a man he had chosen in a diner at the end of the world. The engine caught on the first kick. He rode east. Sandra Marsh's story, published 72 hours later. It ran simultaneously in the Denver Independent, in 3 affiliated outlets, and was picked up by every major wire service within 6 hours of going live. Ryder read it on a laptop in a motel room in Golden, sitting on the edge of a bed with a cup of gas station coffee going cold on the nightstand, the blue light of the screen illuminating his face in the dark. The headline was simple. The details were not. He read it twice without moving and then closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a long time. He didn't feel triumph. He felt the way the air feels after a long storm finally passes clean and exhausted and strangely still, as if the atmosphere itself needs time to remember what calm is supposed to feel like. Judge Harlan Voss was removed from the bench within 48 hours, his judicial chambers sealed by federal agents, and his assets frozen pending investigation. 14 additional arrests followed in the next 10 days. A state senator, 2 county officials, a retired federal supervisor whose name appeared on 31 separate financial transactions in Rachel Mercer's files. Dale Weston was apprehended 8 days later at a private airfield outside Tucson, attempting to board a charter flight to a country with no extradition treaty. The marshals who arrested him found 3 passports in 3 different names, 2 encrypted phones, and a briefcase containing documentation sufficient to establish his operational role in the network going back 11 years. He didn't say anything when they put the cuffs on, just looked at the agents the way a man looks at something he had calculated the probability of and had finally arrived at. Sheriff Boyd Creel cooperated. He provided testimony that connected Voss to operations in 4 states and identified the names of the two women Forge had given him. One had been found alive in a safe house outside El Paso, malnourished and frightened, but breathing. The other had not been found. Forge received this information in a phone call from Nora Aldridge, sitting alone in the Iron Veil garage in Flagstaff, with his hands flat on the workbench, and the overhead light buzzing, and the rest of the club keeping a careful distance. He sat there for 30 seconds after the call ended. Then he stood up, walked outside, and did not mention either of the women again in any conversation that anyone was present for. He carried it the way he carried everything that cost the most. Quietly, completely, without putting it down. The federal prosecutor assigned to the Voss case called Ryder as a witness. The testimony lasted 4 hours in a conference room in Denver, with a court reporter and 2 assistant prosecutors, and a view out the window of the mountains he had ridden through. When it was over, the lead prosecutor shook his hand at the door and said the boy was right about you. Ryder didn't ask what that meant. He already knew. 3 weeks after the meadow, he rode north. The Oregon coast in November is not a gentle place. The Pacific comes in hard off the open water, gray and enormous and indifferent to anything happening on the shore, and the wind along the headlands has an opinion about everything. The town of Bandon sits at the place where the Coquille River meets the ocean, a small, careful place of fishing boats and weathered storefronts and fog that comes in off the water in the evenings and softens all the edges of things. Claire Ashton's house was a stone cottage on a bluff above the beach with a tin roof and a garden that had been recently tended and a porch that faced the water. Ryder found the address from a letter the marshal's office had sent to Forge's clubhouse because Ryder had listed the Iron Veil as his contact of record, which was the first time he had done that in 3 years. He parked the Harley on the street and walked up the path. The sound of the surf came up from below the bluff, steady and ancient, and completely uninvested in whatever was happening above it. The front door opened before he reached the porch. Eli stood in the frame. He was wearing a flannel shirt in a blue plaid pattern and jeans that actually fit and clean sneakers with the laces done properly. His hair was washed and his face was fuller just slightly, the way faces fill in when meals become reliable and sleep becomes something that happens in a safe place. He looked his age for the first time since Ryder had known him. He looked like a child. They stood 10 feet apart and looked at each other in the November light, with the wind coming in off the Pacific and the sound of the surf below them. Eli didn't say anything. Neither did Ryder. Sometimes you arrive at a moment that doesn't need words to establish itself, and this was one of those moments. The distance between them closed, and Eli pressed his face against Ryder's chest, and Ryder's arms came up and wrapped around the boy, and they stood on the path in the wind from the ocean and held on. After a while, Eli stepped back. His eyes were clear. Whatever the past 3 weeks had cost him, and they had cost him a great deal, he was bearing it in the way that children sometimes bear things that should break them by continuing to be themselves inside the weight. "You came," Eli said. "I told you I would. People say a lot of things. I know. I came anyway." A woman appeared in the doorway behind Eli. Claire Ashton was tall with Rachel Mercer's cheekbones and the direct gaze of someone who has spent 20 years in front of a classroom and has consequently stopped being surprised by anything a human being can do. She was perhaps 45 with brown hair going gray at the temples and hands that looked like hands that worked. She looked at Ryder the way someone looks at a person about whom they have heard a great deal and are now assembling the reality against the account. "You're the biker," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Come inside. The coffee's on." Claire Ashton's kitchen was warm and smelled of bread and the salt air that came through every window, regardless of the season. She had made sandwiches without being asked, and the coffee was good, dark and strong, made by someone who understood that coffee is one of the small dignities that makes difficult things more bearable. They sat at the kitchen table, the three of them. Eli ate his sandwich with the focused attention of a boy who had stopped taking food for granted. Claire asked questions with the precision of a teacher and the care of a woman who had just inherited a responsibility she intended to meet fully. About the school Eli would attend, about the counseling that had been arranged, about the legal process that would continue for months as the network was dismantled and the trials began. She's not letting anything past her, Ryder thought. She's building a wall between him and everything that could still hurt him one careful brick at a time. He'll need time, Ryder said. He doesn't show grief the way people expect. He goes quiet. He watches. He measures everyone around him, and when he decides they're safe, he lets them in, but it takes a while. Claire looked at Eli, who was methodically finishing his sandwich and pretending not to listen. My sister was the same way, she said. When we were young, she'd go quiet in a room full of people and not say anything for an hour, and then she'd say one thing that made everything else make sense. She looked back at Ryder. She was the bravest person I have ever known. Ryder said nothing. The coffee cup was warm in his hands. What are you going to do now? Claire said. The question was direct and unhurried and deserved a direct answer. Ride for a while, Ryder said. I have some things to work out. People I owe conversations to. He paused. But I'll be back. That's not a question I'm leaving open. Claire studied him for a moment. Then she nodded once, the nod of someone who has evaluated a statement and found it credible. Good, she said. And that was enough. They spent 2 days walking the coast. The beach below Claire's Bluff was a long stretch of dark sand, with the Pacific coming in gray and heavy under the November sky. They walked without talking much, which suited both of them. They found a piece of driftwood far enough up the beach that the tide wouldn't reach it, and sat there while the water came in and the pelicans worked the surf line and the light changed across the water the way it does on the coast in winter, in slow dramatic shifts from silver to pewter to something almost gold before it faded. On the second afternoon, Eli found a stone that was almost perfectly round, dark gray and smooth from whatever river had carried it before the ocean got it. He turned it over in his hands for a long time. Do you think she knew, Eli said, that it would matter, that people would actually go to prison? I think she knew it was worth trying, Ryder said. I think that's different from knowing how it turns out. Eli was quiet for a while, rolling the stone between his palms. She used to say that the difference between a person who makes a difference and a person who doesn't isn't whether they're scared, he said. It's whether they do the thing anyway. She was right about that. She was right about a lot of things. He looked at the water. She was right about you. Ryder looked at the horizon. The Pacific stretched away to nothing. All that water and all that distance, and somewhere beyond it, other coasts, other people doing the difficult things that difficult situations required of them. On the morning of the third day, Ryder packed his saddlebags. Claire made coffee and left them alone on the porch with it in the view of the water. Eli sat on the porch railing with his coffee cup held in both hands. He watched Ryder check the Harley with the attention of someone storing a thing away carefully for later. You're going, Eli said. Going, not gone. What's the difference? Going means I'm on the road. Not gone means I come back. Whenever you need me. And sometimes when you don't. That's how this works now. Eli looked at his coffee. The ocean moved below them, restless and gray and permanent. Ryder. Yeah. In the diner. When I walked across the room to you. Eli's voice was careful, placing each word deliberately. I wasn't only looking for someone big and scary. I was looking for someone who looked like they needed to be found too. The words arrived in Ryder's chest and stayed there. He stood beside his motorcycle in the pale November morning and felt them settle into whatever space had been empty for the past 3 years. The space that 11 days of silence and a boy walking through a storm door had finally located and named. You found me, Ryder said. Yeah. Ryder crossed the porch and put his hand on the back of Eli's neck. The weight of it, the pressure, the way his squad leader used to do it in foxholes when the waiting became its own kind of violence. The gesture that said without words, I am here, you are not alone. The next breath does not have to be taken without someone beside you. He held it for a moment, then he let go. He walked to the Harley and swung on and put the key in the ignition. Eli came down off the porch and stood on the path and watched him. Claire appeared in the doorway behind the boy, one hand on the doorframe, giving them the moment without interrupting it. Ryder started the engine. The deep guttural sound of it rolled out across the bluff and down toward the water and came back off the cliff face and filled the morning with something that was not quite music, but was not quite not. He looked at Eli one last time. The boy stood in his flannel shirt with his hands in his pockets and his face open in the particular way it was only open when he had decided that a person was trustworthy enough to see it. Not performing, not protecting, just present. Ryder nodded once. Eli nodded back. He rode south along the coast highway with the Pacific to his right and the headlands rising on his left and the November light flat and clean across everything. The road curved with the coastline climbing and falling, and the Harley handled it the way it handled everything, with the reliable sureness of a machine built for exactly this kind of movement through exactly this kind of world. He rode and thought about Forge. They had spoken on the phone 2 nights ago, a long conversation that covered things that had been waiting 3 years to be said. It hadn't been easy, and it hadn't resolved everything, and it hadn't been meant to. Some things repair slowly and over distance, and through the accumulation of smaller things done right. That was the work now. That was what came next. He thought about Jenna. She had sent a text message the morning after the meadow. 3 words, kid safe. Good. He had read it in the parking lot of a gas station and sat on the bike for 10 minutes with his eyes closed. He hadn't responded yet, not because he didn't know what to say, but because what he wanted to say required more than a text message, and he was still working out how to say it. He thought about Patch, who had sent him a photograph without comment. Eli eating a full breakfast at Claire's kitchen table, both hands around a glass of orange juice, looking out the window at the ocean. Ryder had kept the photograph. He thought about Anvil, who had grabbed him by the shoulder outside the Flagstaff clubhouse 2 weeks ago and pulled him into a grip so fierce it compressed his ribs, and then stepped back without saying anything, because Anvil understood that some communications are complete without words. He thought about Rachel Mercer walking out of a motel room at 2 in the morning with her coat on, and her hands shaking and her voice steady. He thought about what it costs to walk toward a thing you know will hurt you because someone smaller than you needs the path to be clear. He thought about his own mother in a hospital bed, 300 miles away, while he was on the road going nowhere. And he thought about the call at 3 in the morning. And he thought about 6 hours on the edge of a motel bed with a dial tone in his ear. He had not made it in time for her. He had made it in time for Eli. He didn't know if that was enough to balance anything. He suspected the mathematics of these things didn't work that cleanly. But he knew that the weight he had been carrying for 11 days, the weight of arriving too late to everything that mattered, had changed its shape. It was still there. It would always be there. But something had been added to the other side of the scale. The road curved inland away from the coast and then back again, and the ocean appeared below him in a gap between the headlands, enormous and silver and permanent as anything in this world. He rode. 6 months later, a letter arrived at the Ironvale Motorcycle Club in Flagstaff, addressed to Ryder Callahan in care of the club. Forge held it for 3 days, which was his way of saying he was glad it had come without actually saying so. He handed it to Ryder on a Friday evening when Ryder rode in from a week on the road, the bike dusty and the road still warm in his bones. The envelope was addressed in handwriting that was improving. The letters careful and deliberate, the hand of someone who had decided that if you were going to do a thing, you should do it properly. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Ryder, I got an A on my essay about someone I admire. I wrote about my mom, but I mentioned you too. My teacher asked me what kind of family you were, and I told her you were the kind that shows up. She wrote a note on the paper that said that was the best definition of family she had ever read from a student. I started building model airplanes. I have 4 of them. Claire lets me hang them from the ceiling of my room, and when the window is open, they move around. Claire says I can have a dog if my grades stay up for the rest of the year. I am going to name him Grim. Come visit soon. Eli. Ryder read the letter standing in the garage bay of the Ironvale clubhouse, with the smell of motor oil and coffee around him, and the sound of brothers working on bikes in the bays beyond the partition. He read it once and then he read it again. Then he folded it carefully along its original creases, the same way it had been folded when it arrived, and he put it in the inside pocket of his leather jacket, against his chest, where it would ride with him. He stepped outside. The Flagstaff evening was the particular kind of cool that comes to high desert towns. In late spring, the sun down behind the pines and the sky still holding color, and the air carrying the smell of juniper and something green from the recent rain. His Harley sat in the lot, waiting, the way it always waited, patient and indifferent, and ready to go wherever the person on its back had decided to go. He stood beside it for a moment in the evening light. The road was still the road. The wind was still the wind. The machine was still a machine made of metal and combustion and the stubbornness of engineering that refuses to overcomplicate what a thing needs to be. But the man who would sit on it was different than the man who had sat on it 11 days into his own silence in a parking lot outside a diner in New Mexico, where a storm was building and the world was about to offer him something he didn't know he needed. He was not running from anything. He swung onto the bike, started the engine, felt the vibration of it come up through the frame and into his hands, familiar as breathing, steady as anything he had ever trusted. He pulled out of the lot and turned north toward the highway. Somewhere ahead of him on the Oregon coast, a boy had 4 model airplanes turning in the wind from his window and was working on his grades and had already decided on the name of a dog he didn't have yet. Somewhere ahead of him, there were roads he hadn't ridden and conversations he owed and things that needed doing in a brotherhood he was in the slow, careful process of earning his way back into. Somewhere ahead of him was everything that came next. The highway opened up beyond the edge of town, and the Harley found its speed and the wind came at him clean and cold from the north, and Ryder Callahan leaned into it and rode toward the dark, in the distance, in the particular promise that every open road makes to the person willing to follow it. Not toward nothing, towards something, and that after everything was the difference.